India is fastly becoming a puppet state of China. It has already been surrounded by a strong coalition of Chinese allies, cornering it upon the continent, and for decades China has been using its immense wealth to cut off India's water supply. They have multiple border disputes over huge amounts of land, and China's naval power is preparing to blockade Indian ports from trading with the outside world. India traditionally has been an ally of the West as a former part of the British Empire, but as China's sphere of influence expands outwards, India is becoming more and more reliant on China, since China began building hundreds of dams on the main rivers that flow through India at the turn of the century. The Indian water scarcity situation has gotten so dire that many geopolitical analysts believe this will be where World War III will break out. If India gets low enough on water that millions of people begin to die, it may have to go to war with China to secure the supply, which would be war between two nuclear-armed powers and change the course of civilization forever. But why is China blocking India's water supply? And why might India have to sacrifice its independence to survive? Well, first we have to go back to 1947.
Now it is for Indian leaders to decide the future of their country.
India gained its independence from the British Empire after aiding the UK in World War II, and ever since has been a strong ally of the West. They had a close connection with the British as a part of the Commonwealth, and in the last 20 years that has become extremely important for the West as the only large allied nation in East Asia to combat the Chinese hegemony on the continent. But this is beginning to change. India has a population of over 1.4 billion people, but the country is running out of water. Due to global warming, water supplies are naturally decreasing, but there is another, far greater cause, and that's what China is doing just north of the border. China has been building dams on the Indian border for decades. Along the region there are multiple dams under construction along the Brahmaputra River, one of the main water sources for India. India is already very stretched for water, as one of the most scarce places in the world to find it. What compounds this effect is the most populated regions of India are near the Chinese border and most at risk of severe drought for months at a time. Now, although this is bad for the Indians, this is brilliant for the Chinese. Firstly, the geopolitical tool they now have against India is devastating to their main Asian rival, and this helps to solidify China's position as the dominant power. Secondly, China needs water. China has a population of over 1 billion people, even more than India, and with the severe amount of water usage from heavy industry, the northern plains of China are projected to go dry by 2030, so the government is thinking ahead and is planning to use these dams to divert India's water to remain in the country and be piped up north. The final reason for the dam's construction is the godly amount of power it can produce. Now, unlike the West, China really doesn't care about climate change, but nevertheless the power alone that comes out of the Three Gorges Dam makes up for 10% of China's total electricity consumption, and that level of power cannot be ignored by the government. China's sphere of influence has grown exponentially in the last 2 decades, to a point now where the whole of the Asian continent are Chinese allies, with the exception of one huge nation, yes, India. India has the same population as China, except India's is much younger. A key advantage, let me explain why. One of the huge reasons why China will collapse in the next few decades is down to its old population. Due to the effects of the one-child policy, China's birth rate fell overnight under Mao, and ever since the damage has been irreversibly done. As the population gets old, it murders the economy as there aren't enough young people to produce economically. The culture in China is that children are largely unnecessary and just expensive pets. This is the total opposite for India. They have a huge young population, similar to that relative of Britain in the 1800s, meaning the Indian economic boom is coming later, as China is the hegemon for the region, and as their imperial power peaks in the next 5 years, they are looking to kill India whilst they themselves are strong before their collapse. And due to excellent geopolitical strategy, they have successfully isolated their neighbor India in so many ways. China has invested heavily into Bangladesh, spending $38 billion on infrastructure, drastically improving relations. Across the other side, China and Pakistan have set up an economic corridor with access to the Indian Ocean that connects to China's Belt and Road system. Myanmar is also firmly aligned to China again through financial, military, and infrastructural agreements. Sri Lanka fell into the Chinese debt trap and now has multiple Chinese territories and military bases on its land. Nepal and Bhutan are also Chinese allies. All of these nations have Chinese military bases on them, ready at all times to attack India from all angles if needed and wipe them out. But even more ingeniously, China hasn't just surrounded India by land. It also has the nation cornered on the ocean front as well. Naval bases strategically placed placed all around the Indian Ocean have barricaded India's ports to form the Great Chinese String of Pearls, with key ports in Gwadar, Pakistan, the Maldives, Sri Lanka, and Kayakpiu in Myanmar. This rams India into only its own coastline, and theoretically could prevent Allied forces from coming to help the Indians in a war situation, leading to further isolation and separation from its Western allies. And it's definitely having an effect. India is now beginning to side with China on more and more global issues. For example, when war broke out in Ukraine, as the vast majority of the West sided with Ukraine and condemned Russia, India opted to stay neutral, as Russia is a key Chinese ally, citing that Europe's problems are not the world's problems.
Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems.
India also joined a Chinese bloc coalition called BRICS. The alliance also includes Russia, Brazil, and South Africa. However, virtually all these economies in the alliance are dependent economically on the greater American alliance. In real terms, I'm doubtful if World War were to break out this would be the alliance of the future. But nonetheless, the fact India joined this group says a lot about their future intentions, which leads India at a crossroads. Thinking about it from an individual perspective, if you were an Indian and went a few days without water, you'd either push the nation to concede to the Chinese or pick up the guns and go to war. Populations will fight to the death for their water supply, since death is the only other option if they do nothing. Ultimately, this is one of the great hotspots for potential World War III breakout, and because of the size of the population on both sides, this could easily turn into the largest bloodbath ever seen in human history. If India got so desperate for water that they would declare war on China, we could see over 50 million people die in the matter of a few months, way more than in the world wars. The more likely alternative, however, is that India moves much closer to China, with the basis for it to become a puppet state as it becomes dependent for the most basic resource in the world, water. China can use this as a geopolitical linchpin to control India, knowing that with a push of a button it could starve it of water, and kill 100 million people in a month if they don't obey the rule of the CCP. Another scenario is that China might collapse before this ever becomes a war-scale issue. It's a virtual certainty that China will collapse, as it has done throughout history. China unifies, then breaks into warlord states, then unifies again, and so on. But we don't know whether that will be in 5 years or 20 years, and unfortunately for India, China is building these dams very fast. The leadership of India has done an appalling job of trying to prevent any of this from happening, and from their own indecisiveness, find themselves in the position where China has effectively checkmated them into dependency and puppethood. Only time will truly tell. Now find out why the United Kingdom is collapsing, or why Mexico will become a superpower, and subscribe for more information on the future of our world.